Hello guys, in this video I want to talk about the cerebrum. The cerebrum is a location of conscious thought process, and this is the origin of all complex intellectual functions. It's readily identified as two large hemispheres when we look from the superior. The functional activities in your cerebrum enable you to read and comprehend the words in your textbook, turn the pages, form and remember ideas, and talk about what you've learned. It's the center of your intelligence, reasoning, thought, memory, and job. Your voluntary control of skeletal muscle movement and conscious perception of your senses like your vision, your hearing, touch, smell, and taste happen in your cerebral hemisphere. Associated with the cerebrum, we have distinctive regions for the gray matter. I hope you remember that. In the brain, the gray matter or the cortex is located outside and the white matter is located inside. In the cerebral cortex, we have different regions, and each of these regions can function the specific integration. The cerebrum, as you see in the previous picture, is composed of two halves. We call them left and right cerebral hemisphere. The paired cerebral hemisphere are separated by a narrow, deep cleft, which we call it longitudinal fissure, which extend along the mid-sagittal plane. The cerebral hemisphere are separated from one each other, except at the few locations where the bundles of axon, which we call them tract, form white matter region that allow the communication between them. In this picture, you can see this white matter which can communicate between these two right and left hemisphere. The largest of these white matter is called corpus callosum, which can connect the hemisphere. The corpus callosum provides the main method of communication between these two hemispheres. 3 points should be kept in mind regarding the cerebral hemisphere. Although selected regions of the cerebral cortex do participate in specific functions, in many cases, it's difficult to assign a precise function to a specific region of cerebral cortex. Considerable overlapping and indistinct boundaries permit a single region of cerebral cortex to exhibit several different functions. Additionally, some aspects of cortical function, such as memory or consciousness, cannot easily be assigned to any single region. The next important point is this. As a general rule, both cerebral hemispheres receive their sensory information from and project motor command to the opposite side of the body. The right cerebral hemisphere controls the left side of your body, and the left cerebral hemisphere controls the right side of your body. And the last point is this. The two cerebral hemispheres appear as anatomic mirror images, but they display some functional differences, which we call them cerebral lateralization. For example, the region of the brain that are responsible for controlling speech and understanding verbalization are frequently located in your left cerebral hemisphere. These types of differences primarily affect the higher order function. Now, I want to talk about the different lobes which we have in our cerebrum. We have 5 lobes in each cerebral hemisphere, which we talked about it before in the lab. Each cerebral hemisphere is divided into 5 anatomically distinct lobes. 4 of these lobes are visible on the external surface. We call them frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. And one of the lobes, which we call them insula, is located beneath the temporal lobe, and it's not visible from the surface. The cerebral cortex of each lobe exhibit a specific cortical region and association area. First, about the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe lies deep to the frontal bone and forms the anterior part of the cerebral hemisphere. The frontal lobe ends posteriorly at a deep groove, which we call it central sulcus, that marks its boundary with the parietal lobe. The inferior border of the frontal lobe is called lateral sulcus, and it can separate the frontal and parietal from the temporal lobe. Let me show you a picture of these lobes. In this picture, you can see the central sulcus here, which can divide the frontal and the parietal lobe, and you can see the lateral sulcus, which can divide the frontal and temporal from, the frontal and parietal from the temporal lobe. As you see in this picture, we have a gyrus anterior to the central sulcus, which we call it pericentral gyrus, which is the mass of nervous tissue immediately anterior to the central sulcus. The frontal lobe is primarily concerned with voluntary motor function, including motor function which involve with speech, concentration, verbal communication, decision making, planning, and personality. The next lobe is called parietal lobe. You can see the parietal lobe here. The parietal lobe lies deep to the parietal bone and forms the superior posterior part of each cerebral hemisphere. It terminates anteriorly at the central sulcus, and posteriorly it's the neighbor of occipital lobe. The parietal lobe and occipital are divided from each other by parieto-occipital sulcus, and laterally at the lateral sulcus. An important anatomic feature which we can see in the lobe is called postcentral gyrus, which is located in the posterior part of the central sulcus. And this part is a mass of nervous tissue which can control the sensory function. It involves with general sensory function like evaluation of the shapes and texture of objects being touched, and sensory input regarding body position from proprioceptors within our joints and muscles. The next lobe of our brain is called, our cerebral is called temporal lobe. The temporal lobe lies internal to the temporal bone and inferior to the lateral sulcus. The cerebral cortex of this lobe is involved with hearing and smell. The next lobe is called occipital lobe, and it's located beneath the occipital bone and forms the posterior region of each hemisphere. The cerebral cortex of the occipital lobe is responsible for processing incoming visual information and storing visual memories. And the last lobe which we have, which is invisible from the surface, is called insula, and it's located deep to the lateral sulcus. The insula is a small lobe deep to the lateral sulcus. It can be observed by laterally reflecting the temporal lobe. The insula's lack of accessibility have prevented aggressive studies of its function, but the cerebral cortex of the insula is apparently involved in the memory and the interpretation of the taste. So it's important for the sense of taste. Now, I want to talk about the motor areas. The cortical areas that control motor function are housed within the frontal lobes. The primary motor cortex, also called the somatic motor cortex or area, is specifically located within the pericentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. Neurons in this area control voluntary skeletal muscle activity. The axon of these neurons project contralateral, to the opposite side of the body, within either the brainstem and the spinal cord. Thus, the left primary motor cortex controls the skeletal muscle on the right side of the body, and the right primary motor cortex controls the skeletal muscle on the left side of the body. The distribution of the primary motor cortex innervation to various parts of the body is shown in this picture, and you can see it here. For example, this region can control the motor function of your toes, your ankle, your knee, hip, trunk, shoulder, and so on. So it's very well organized, and this is the pericentral gyrus. In this pericentral gyrus, you have different regions, and this region, you can see the center for controlling the specific part of the body. Certain motor functions have been mapped to specific areas of the frontal lobe, including the motor speech area and the frontal eye field. The motor speech area is called Broca's area. It's located in the most individuals within the inferior lateral portion of the left frontal lobe. So it's located in the left side, and it can control movements for vocalization. The other center which we have in the frontal lobe is called frontal eye field. This frontal eye field is located on superior surface of middle frontal gyrus, and it can regulate eye movement needed for reading and binocular vision. And also, we have a cortex in the frontal lobe, which we call it perimotor cortex. The perimotor cortex is called somatic motor association area. And in this part, it's very important. First, you need to know that it's located anterior to perimotor cortex, and it can coordinate learned skilled activity, such as moving your eye in coordinated fashion when reading a book or when you are playing guitar. An individual who has sustained trauma to this area would still be able to understand written letter and word, but would have difficulty reading because his or her eye couldn't follow the line on the printed page. We have some sensory area in our cerebrum. The cortical areas within the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes and the insula are involved with conscious awareness of sensation, as we talked about it before. Each of the major senses has a distinct cortical area. Keep in mind as you read through this part in your textbook, each primary sensory cortical region is the specific area of the cortex that receives sensory input from the specific type of receptor. In addition, each primary cortical region typically has an association area. The general function of association area is to receive input from the primary region and integrate the current sensory input with previous experiences and memories. So in the association area, we can integrate what we see, we hear, we smell, and taste before. The primary somatosensory cortex is located in the parietal lobe. It's located in the postcentral gyrus. And in this part, we can receive somatic sensory information from proprioceptors, touch, pain, pressure, and temperature receptors. And somatosensory association area is located immediately posterior to the postcentral gyrus in our parietal lobe, and it can integrate touch information, allowing us to identify different objects by feeling. Look at this picture. In this picture, you can see the primary somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory cortex, as you see in this picture, is located in the parietal lobe. It's located in the postcentral gyrus. For example, the sensation of your genital region is located here, your toes, foot, and leg is located in this region, your hip, trunk, neck, and so on. So each part of this postcentral gyrus deals with one specific region of our body. The other sensory areas are listed here. We have primary visual cortex. It's located in the occipital lobe. And we have one visual association area in the occipital lobe, which can integrate color, form, and memory to allow us to identify things which we see, like different faces. The primary auditory cortex is located in the temporal lobe, and in the temporal lobe we have auditory association area, which can interpret sound, store and retrieve the memories of different sounds. The other sensory areas are called primary olfactory cortex. It's located in the temporal lobe, and it can provide conscious awareness of a smell. The primary gustatory cortex is located in the insula, and it involves in processing of taste information. So these are the different sensory areas which we have in the lobes of our brain. The other parts which we have, the other functions which we have in our brain is can integrate information from multiple association areas. Now, this part I want to talk about functional brain region. In the functional brain region, we can process all the information which come from different association areas. For example, we have prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, which is located in our frontal lobe, can integrate complex thought, judgment, personality, planning, and deciding. And This development of this region continues when we are adult. The other region is called vernix area. The vernix area is located in the left hemisphere of our brain, and the vernix area is involved in recognizing, understanding, and comprehending spoken and written language. As you may expect, the vernix area and the motor speech area should work together so we can have a very good communication. We have a problem, we have a disorder which we call it autism. Autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, which we simply call it autism, is a widely variable disorders of neural development that affect 1 in 88 children in the United States. We can recognize it in early childhood, but diagnosis may be difficult until a child is older. Individuals with ASD often are highly sensitive to stimuli such as loud noises or unfamiliar people. They may struggle in adjusting to different changes in routine. Discomfort due to overstimulation or frustration in the inability to communicate. Other behavior and traits commonly associated with ASD include repetitive motion like hand flapping or rocking, resistance to change in routine, inability to engage in pretended play, inability to gauge the feeling of others, and intense interest in particular activity or subject. Treatment of ASD includes proven methods of speech and behavioral therapy, as well as holistic approaches that involve various diets, supplements, and experimental process. Some children with autism will go on to develop skills and live independent lives, whereas some others won't. The biggest predictors for independence in adulthood are level of intelligence and their ability to do communication. Different causes are genetics, environmental, and biochemical factors, and male have 4 times higher incidence than female. Now I want to talk about the cerebral white matter. The white matter, you know that, is located deep to the gray matter. It's composed of myelinated axons, which are grouped into different tracts. I hope you remember that. The bundles of axon in the central nervous system is called tract, while these bundles of axon in the peripheral nervous system are called nerves. We have 3 types of tracts. One of them is called association, one of them is called commissural, and the other one is called projection. First, I want to talk about the association tract. The association tract can connect different regions of cerebral cortex within the same hemisphere. You can see arcuate fibers here, which can connect neighboring gyri in one hemisphere, and longitudinal fasciculi, which can connect the gyri in one lobe to the gyri in the other lobe, but in one hemisphere. So the association tracts are divided into arcuate fibers and longitudinal fasciculi. The arcuate fibers can connect gyri, which are neighbor together, but longitudinal fasciculi can connect the gyri from one lobe to the other lobe. The other tract which we have here are called the commissural tract. In this picture, picture, you can see the commissural tract. The commissural tract can connect the regions in two different hemispheres. For example, here you can see the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum can connect right and left hemisphere together. And the last tract which I want to introduce you is called projection tract. The projection tract can link cerebral cortex to the inferior brain region and also the spinal cord. Corticospinal tract. These are the corticospinal tract which carry signal from cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. When these projection tracts pass through the diencephalon, specifically the thalamus region, we call them internal capsules. Let me show it to you. As this projection tract passes between thalamus and cerebral nuclei, we call them internal capsule too. And here you can see the internal capsule. The other thing which I want to talk about is called Pathalias. Anatomically, the left and right cerebral hemisphere appear identical, but careful examination reveals a number of differences. Humans tend to have shape asymmetries of the frontal and occipital lobe, which we call it Pathalias. Look at this picture. Here you see that we have a protrusion of lobe in one side when we compare it with the other lobe. Here we have protrusion of frontal lobe, which we call it right frontal Pathalias. And here we have protrusion of occipital lobe, which we call it left occipital Pathalias. Occipital Pathalias. And left-handed individuals are opposite. And the other which you need to know is the hemisphere also differ with respect to some of their function, which I talked about it before. Each hemisphere tend to be specialized for certain task, a phenomenon which we call it cerebral lateralization or hemispheric lateralization. Higher order counters in both hemispheres tend to have different but complementary functions. For example, the vernix area and the motor speech area is only located in the left hemisphere. I will talk about the diencephalon in the next video.